Roll right through, it's not locked.
That's what the HOA president yelled to her tour caravan as her locksmith fired up an angle grinder against the padlock on my front gate. I sat in my truck 200 yards up the ridge. I watched 14 vehicles, 2 food trucks, and a champagne tent crawl onto my private easement like the ranch already belonged to her. She had listed my 320-acre cattle operation as a Sunday Hill Country open house. A vintage Cadillac led the line. That woman wrote fake listings for absent neighbors so often that she forgot what happens when the real owner is watching from the cedars. She didn't know the gate had been rebuilt 3 weeks earlier. She didn't know the Texas Rangers were watching her caravan from a screen in Austin. So I didn't drive down. I didn't shout. I tapped one button and let the steel do the talking. Tell me below, would you have shut her down right then, or let her tape her own confession? My name is Wyatt Brooks, and the ranch sits 2 miles south of Field Creek along Farm to Market 2147 in Llano County, Texas. My grandfather Cyrus Brooks bought the original parcel in 1948 with money he saved working the rigs in Kilgore. My father added the back 80 in 1971. I added the irrigation line in the pump house the year my daughter Hannah was born. We run about 140 head of Black Angus, plus a small herd of Hereford crosses for my own freezer. It is not a fancy operation. It is a clean operation. I spent 22 years as a Texas Department of Public Safety trooper before I traded the cruiser for the cattle truck. I still keep my radios tuned to county dispatch out of habit. My wife Ellie passed 4 years ago this November. Ovarian cancer. 18 months from the first scan to the funeral, and the only fight I ever lost in my whole life. Hannah was finishing her sophomore year at Texas A&M when it happened. She came home that summer to help me bottle feed 2 orphan calves and figure out how to cook a chicken without burning the kitchen down. She is in vet school now, top of her class. She calls every Sunday night, whether she has time or not. After Ellie died, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I worked. I rebuilt the south fence line. I dug a new stock tank near the live oaks where she used to sit and read. I installed a custom electronic gate at the head of the drive, biometric reader, license plate camera, emergency lockdown protocol. The loneliness was too loud, and the security cameras gave me something to check at night besides the empty side of the bed. People in town joke that the Brooks Gate is fancier than a bank vault. They are not entirely wrong. The trouble started the spring after the developer broke ground on the 800-acre parcel that bordered my north line. The Hadley family had owned that piece since the Eisenhower administration. They sold it to a Houston outfit called Pence Heritage Holdings. Within a year, the bulldozers had carved out 112 oversized lots, a clubhouse with a pretentious bell tower, and a stone monument at the front entrance that read, Hill Country Vista Estates. The first letter showed up in May. Cream paper, gold foil HOA crest, signed in the looping script of Madam President herself, Amber Holloway. The letter welcomed me to the community. It informed me that my ranch had been annexed into the HOA service area pursuant to a recorded easement. It outlined the 17-page rulebook I was now expected to follow. Boat storage, wreath colors, mailbox heights, livestock noise ordinances, the works. There was a footnote at the bottom assessing me $4,200 in first-year community amenity fees. I read the letter twice, poured a second cup of coffee, and laughed out loud. Then I drove into town to pull a copy of the easement map at the Llano County Recorder's office. I have a friend there, May Harlow, sweet old gal, played dominoes with my mother for 30 years. May pulled the file. There was no annexation. There was no recorded easement. The road was a private easement my grandfather had recorded in 1962 in his own name. The only authority over Brooks Cattle Company was sitting at my dining room table eating venison sausage on a biscuit. I drove home and threw the letter in the burn barrel. Big mistake. People like Amber Holloway take silence as permission. By the time the second letter arrived, she had already drawn up the listing. The second letter came on a Tuesday morning. This one was not a letter at all. It was a glossy 4-color flyer. A drone photograph of my ranch ran across the cover. Printed in bold across the gate in the photo were the words, Exclusive Hill Country Estate Tour, Sunday 1 p.m., by appointment with Holloway Premier Realty. The listing itself ran on the back page. 320 pristine acres of legacy ranch land, ready for transition, conservation eligible, off-market opportunity for the discerning buyer. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the flyer for a long time. The percolator on the stove gurgled twice. A mockingbird outside the window worked through 3 different songs in a row. Then I called the Texas Real Estate Commission and asked what kind of license a person needed to list someone else's property. The lady on the other end laughed once. Then she stopped laughing. Then she asked me if I had a copy of the listing in front of me. I did. I emailed it to her while she was still on the line. That Sunday I drove into town for cattle cubes and a fresh tube of grease for the loader. I came back at 1:45 in the afternoon to find 8 vehicles parked along my driveway. A pearl white Tahoe, 2 Range Rovers, a Mercedes G-Wagon, 3 lifted pickups with dealer plates, and a vintage cream Cadillac convertible that did not belong on a working ranch any more than a chandelier belonged on a hay barn. The gate was open. I had left it open that morning while I shifted hay bales, and the latch tends to grab the bumper if I'm not careful. That window of carelessness was all she needed. I parked behind the last Range Rover, killed the engine, and walked up toward my own porch. There were people standing in my front yard. A man in linen pants squinted up at the rafters of my hay barn, while his wife photographed the live oaks. 2 teenagers leaned over the gate of my cattle pen, asking nobody in particular whether you could keep horses there. A woman with a Holloway Premier Realty clipboard pointed at my pump house, explaining the irrigation potential to a couple in matching golf shirts. In the middle of it stood Amber Holloway, late 40s, linen blazer over white slacks, sunglasses she did not bother to take off, even on a covered porch. She held up a hand the way a tour guide quiets a museum group. She turned toward me with that bright, brittle smile of a woman who hadn't yet realized the ground had shifted under her heels. "Wyatt," she said, like we were old friends. "I am so glad you stopped by. I was just telling these wonderful folks about the heritage you've built here. Don't worry, we're only window shopping." I stopped on the second step. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "Amber, this ranch is not for sale." "Oh, I know that," she said, waving the words away like a fly. "But you and I both know the time is coming, and these buyers are pre-qualified up to 7 figures. I just wanted them to feel the property. There is no harm in feeling the property, is there?" The man in linen pants was now leaning over my well casing. I looked past Amber at her clients. None of them looked malicious. They looked confused and a little embarrassed, like they had wandered into the wrong wedding reception. Most of them were already glancing at the doors of their cars. "Folks," I said, "I'm sorry you came out here on a Sunday for nothing. This property is not listed. The agent who told you it was does not represent the owner. The owner is me, and I am asking you, politely, to leave." 12 minutes later, the last Range Rover rolled out the gate. Amber stood in the driveway, one hand on her hip, looking at me like I had personally insulted her grandmother. "You will regret embarrassing me in front of those people, Wyatt." She climbed into her Tahoe and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the side mirror. That afternoon I called Cal Whitaker, the Llano County Sheriff, and a man I had ridden patrol with for 9 years. I asked him an old colleague's question. He listened. He did not laugh. "Wyatt," he said, "if you're asking what I think you're asking, start documenting everything. Today." So I did. By Wednesday, I had a sheriff's deputy out at the ranch taking a written incident report and photographing the flyer. By Friday, a polite but firm cease and desist letter from a real estate attorney out of Austin was sitting in Amber Holloway's mailbox. The letter directed her to remove the listing immediately, retract all printed materials, and stay off the property. She did none of those things. I also reset the gate. The biometric reader stayed. I activated the license plate recognition module that I had paid extra for and never bothered to use. I built a permitted vehicle list of about 40 plates: family, neighbors, the propane delivery, the mineral guy from Mason, my pasture vet, the FedEx driver who waves every morning. Anything outside the list would trip a soft alarm to my phone. Anything that tried to force entry would trigger the emergency lockdown. Then I rolled out a second strand of barbed wire along the inner cattle gate, the one between my driveway and the pasture where the heifers winter. If somebody got through the front, the cattle would still be safely fenced from the road. That was a habit from my trooper years. You build a system that protects the innocent first. The next Sunday came up cool and clear. A north wind out of Coleman County smelled like rain that wouldn't quite arrive. I spent the morning at the kitchen table running the books for September, sausage and biscuits on the plate beside me. At 1:11 my phone buzzed. Gate, unauthorized vehicle. Tahoe, 8GZW742. Then another buzz, 8 seconds later. Gate, unauthorized vehicle. Range Rover, 4LMR 918. Then another, and another. I stood up slowly, walked to the front window, and pulled back the curtain. From the porch, I could see the line of vehicles stacked at the closed gate, the way beetles stack up at a dam. In the middle of the driveway, on the wrong side of my fence, Amber Holloway stood in front of her Tahoe and pointed at the gate like it had personally offended her. Beside her stood a man in a tan work shirt, with a logo over the pocket that read, Slattery Lock and Gate. He held a pair of 42-inch bolt cutters and a portable air compressor. "Cut the lock," she said. I could hear her clearly through the porch screen. The locksmith hesitated. He looked at the bolt cutters. He looked at the gate. He looked at the line of luxury cars stretching back 50 yards down my private drive. "Ma'am, are you sure this property is yours? Because the work order says..." "It is my listing," she snapped, "and it is on the market, and these buyers have appointments. Cut the lock." He cut the lock. The padlock fell into the dirt with a small, dull clink. The chain rattled loose. Amber pulled the gate open with the theatrical satisfaction of a woman cutting a ribbon. The Pearl Tahoe rolled forward. The Range Rover followed. 2 more vehicles edged through. That is when the heifers, spooked by the compressor and the unfamiliar engines, turned as a herd and started trotting toward the inner gate. I have seen cattle in motion my whole life. I know how fast 140 head can move when something startles them. The inner gate held. The barbed wire I had run that week held. For one slow, quiet second, I saw what would have happened to my herd. I saw what would have happened to whoever was driving down FM 2147 at 55 miles an hour, if that second fence had not been there. I walked outside. Amber had a phone up, recording. She was narrating something about buyer access and the seller's resistance. The locksmith was already packing his cutters into a side compartment of his truck. He had the look of a man beginning to understand what he had just helped someone do. I did not raise my voice. I held up my own phone, screen out, and tapped record. "Sir," I said to the locksmith, "I want to make sure you can hear me clearly. This property belongs to me. There is no listing. There is no work order signed by any owner. The padlock you cut belongs to me. The gate you damaged contains 140 head of livestock. You have been deceived. I would like your statement." He set the bolt cutters down very slowly. Amber's face went the color of skim milk. "Cattle gates are not ornaments in this part of Texas. Damage one bad enough to release a herd onto a public farm-to-market road, and a county prosecutor will take a long, calm look at felony charges. Ask any rancher who has buried a cow killed by a tourist's pickup. The fact that nothing escaped that morning was luck and a second fence." I told them both, politely, to wait while I called the sheriff. The deputy who took the report at the gate that Sunday was a young man named Truett Quinn. He had grown up 2 counties west, and he held his pen like it was a pistol he didn't want to misfire. He photographed the cut padlock. He photographed the bolt cutters in the bed of Slattery's truck. He took Slattery's sworn statement that the work order had been provided by Amber Holloway, under the express representation that she was either the owner or the listing agent of record. Slattery cried twice during that statement, once when he understood that he had committed criminal mischief on the orders of a woman with no authority, once when he asked me whether his business license was finished. I told him, honestly, that depended on whether he kept being honest. Amber sat in the back of her Tahoe, with the door open, on her phone, talking very fast and very loud to a man on the other end I would later learn was her husband Brett, an associate planner with the Llano County Department of Development Services. By Tuesday morning, 3 things had happened. The first was a certified mail letter from the HOA, signed once again by Madam President. The letter assessed Brooks Cattle Company $42,400 in back HOA dues, unauthorized livestock noise penalties, and aesthetic non-conformance fees. The letter cited specific articles of a covenant document I had never seen and had never signed. It demanded payment within 14 days, after which a lien would be placed against the property. The second was a fresh for sale sign hammered into the cedar post at the front of my drive. Holloway Premier Realty. Big, crisp letters. Below the sign was a smaller placard. Estate tour. Sundays. All offers considered. The post was not on her property. It was on mine. The third was a complaint, filed at the Llano County Sheriff's Office under a different case number, alleging that the operation at Brooks Cattle Company was producing excessive nighttime noise in violation of HOA rules. The complainant was listed as Hill Country Vista Estates HOA, care of Amber Holloway. Attached were 2 grainy audio clips, both of which contained the unmistakable mooing of cattle. One of the clips had been recorded from her own backyard in broad daylight. I sat in the kitchen and laid all 3 documents out on the table. Then I drove into town to see May Harlow at the recorder's office. May looked up when she saw me coming. She had the look of a woman who had been hoping I'd come in. "Wyatt," she said, "shut the door." I shut the door. May lowered her voice. "I've been watching that woman for 9 months. She's done the same thing to 4 other ranches. The Crittenden place out toward Castell, the old Rumberger orchard. 2 parcels along Honey Creek that used to belong to Reese Halverson. All of them got annexation letters they didn't sign. 2 of them folded, sold under cost. The other 2 are still fighting." I did not say anything for a long moment. "May," I said, "I need copies of every annexation document she has filed in this office in the last 18 months. I need every plat that her husband has touched. And I need them off the books, paid, receipted, public records request, all the way clean." May nodded once. "I figured. I've already got most of them pulled in the back." I walked out of the recorder's office that afternoon with a banker's box of paperwork weighing about 35 pounds. I drove straight to the sheriff's office. Cal Whitaker met me at the side door, the one that does not face the public lobby. "Wyatt," he said, "you remember Drew McAllister?" I did. Sergeant Drew McAllister, Texas Ranger Company F. We had run a joint operation together my last year on the force. Drew is 15 minutes out. He's bringing a friend from the white-collar unit. I set the box of paperwork down on the conference room table. The fluorescent lights buzzed once. Outside, somebody was firing up a riding mower. The smell of cut grass came in through the open window. "Cal," I said, "she's not running an HOA. She's running a real estate fraud operation through a fake HOA, and her husband is laundering it through county documents." Cal Whitaker had been my partner on the worst night of my career. He looked at me the way he had looked at me that night. "Then let's bury her in her own paperwork," he said. Sergeant Drew McAllister had not changed much in the years since I had last seen him. Tall, lean, the kind of man who keeps his Stetson on indoors and apologizes for it once. He arrived in the conference room with another man behind him in plain clothes, khakis, a navy polo, no badge visible. Drew tipped his hat. "Wyatt, long time." "Long time, Drew." "This is Special Agent Trent Reardon, FBI, San Antonio Field Office, Financial Crimes." Reardon had a quiet handshake and the careful eyes of a man who had spent 10 years reading paperwork until the patterns showed up like watermarks. He set a battered laptop on the conference table and asked permission before he opened it. That is how you can tell the good ones. For 2.5 hours, we walked through the boxes of documents May had pulled. We laid out maps. We laid out plats. We laid out the 4 other annexation letters from properties scattered across Llano County. We laid out the original Brooks easement, recorded January 11, 1962. The hand was the steady cursive of a county clerk who could not have known her work would still matter 64 years later. Drew was the one who saw it first. "Wyatt," he said, "look at the signature blocks on these annexation maps." I looked. The maps that supposedly placed the 4 other ranches and my own ranch inside the HOA boundary all bore the same notarization stamp, the same notary number, the same signature. The signature belonged to Brett Holloway. The notary commission belonged to Brett Holloway. The county planning department employee who had stamped each of these maps as received and recorded was Brett Holloway. "Brett notarizes the maps his wife forges," Drew said. "Then he files them through his own desk. Then she walks the maps out to buyers as proof the ranch is annexed and ready to be listed." Reardon was already typing. "It gets better," he said, without looking up. "Pence Heritage Holdings, the Houston developer that built Hill Country Vista Estates. They're the buyer of record on 2 of the 4 properties that already sold under duress. Pence pays Holloway Premier Realty an undisclosed 3% referral fee on every annexed parcel that closes. We've been watching Pence for 8 months on a separate matter. They're also under federal review for misrepresentations to FHA underwriters in the El Paso market." "So it's not just an HOA scam," Cal said. "No," Reardon said. "It's wire fraud, mail fraud, forgery of public documents, deprivation of property under color of authority, and conspiracy. And every one of those charges is federal." I sat very still. Outside the window, the afternoon sun was sliding behind the cedar ridge and turning the gravel parking lot the color of an old penny. Cal Whitaker poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and offered me one. I took it. "What do you need from me?" I said. Reardon closed his laptop. Mr. Brooks, you have something nobody else on this list has. You have a recorded easement from 1962 that legally annihilates her annexation theory. You have a working livestock operation that creates a public safety risk every time she trespasses. You have a custom security system that records every entry. And you have the patience to use all three at once. Drew leaned back in his chair and adjusted his Stetson. We need her to do it again, on camera, with a federal observer in place. I looked at the three of them across the long Formica table. Then I'll bait the next Sunday, I said, and we'll see how big her hole goes. Reardon smiled for the first time since he had walked into the room. Brooks, he said, if you bait it correctly, she'll dig the hole herself. Over the next 10 days, the ranch became something between a working cattle operation and a federal stakeout that smelled like cedar smoke and brewed coffee. Drew McAllister came out twice. The first time he walked the entire fence line with me, taking notes on which sight lines would carry a camera signal and which would lose it in a draw. The second time he brought a quiet woman from Austin named Glenda Sutherland. Glenda was an investigator with the Texas Real Estate Commission. She had been opening complaints against Amber Holloway for 14 months. She had not been able to prove the listings were unauthorized until I emailed her a copy of the estate tour flyer the previous Sunday. Glenda explained the licensing piece in 20 minutes flat, the way only a regulator can. In Texas, a real estate agent who lists a property without written authorization from the owner is committing a per se violation of the Real Estate License Act. The penalty is automatic license suspension, a referral to the Attorney General, and disgorgement of every commission tied to the listing. Stack that on top of the federal wire fraud charges, and Amber Holloway was looking at the kind of week most people only have in nightmares. Trent Reardon came out a third time with 2 unmarked tablets and a small black case the size of a sandwich. Inside the case was a federal-grade body camera that lived in my shirt pocket and a backup broadcast unit that wired into the existing gate system. The whole package fed live into a server in San Antonio. Anything we captured was federal evidence the second the photons hit the lens. I rebuilt the gate logic with Hannah on FaceTime. She had driven down from College Station for the long weekend. She sat at my kitchen table with 2 open laptops and a glass of sweet tea. She walked me through the firmware update like a daughter who had inherited her mother's patience and her father's stubbornness. We set the front gate to lock inward when triggered by an unauthorized cutting attempt. We programmed the inner cattle gate to lock simultaneously. The space between the 2 gates was about 200 feet of crushed limestone driveway. Once both gates closed, anything inside that 200-foot stretch was contained until somebody released them from a phone or a desktop. We did not call it a trap, we called it the corral. I called Earl Henson next. Earl ran the place south of mine and had been on the receiving end of one of Amber's annexation letters in February. He had quietly paid a $3,400 settlement because his late wife had begged him not to spend his retirement on lawyers. He cried on the phone when I told him what we were building. Then he asked, simply, how he could help. I told him to bring his trail camera and his pickup. He said he would be there at 5 in the morning. I called Kyle Wexford last. Kyle ran the news desk at the NBC affiliate in San Antonio. He and I had served together in the Army a long time ago, in a place that taught us both how to keep a secret. I told him only what I needed to tell him. Kyle, this Sunday I might have a story for you.
What kind of story?
The kind where a federal agent and a Texas Ranger and the TREC investigator all happened to be on the same property at the same time. Kyle was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he laughed. Wyatt, I'll bring the truck myself. The bait went out through May Harlow on Wednesday afternoon. May had a coffee shop across the street from the recorder's office that Amber Holloway visited 3 days a week. May mentioned, casually, that Wyatt Brooks would be at his daughter's vet school graduation up in San Marcos that Sunday, and the ranch would be empty until Monday morning. She mentioned it loud enough for the whole counter to hear. Then she went back to her crossword and waited. Within 48 hours, the Holloway Premier Realty website listed a special event for the upcoming Sunday. Hill Country Estate Tour, live music, catered lunch, featured property, a 320-acre legacy ranch with conservation potential. RSVP required. Champagne Lounge open from 1 until 4. The listing closed with a single italicized line. Owner has accepted off-market consultation. All offers welcome. I read the line out loud to Hannah. She closed her laptop, looked across the kitchen at me, and quoted her mother without meaning to. "You really did marry me for the patience, didn't you?" I put my coffee down. I looked at my daughter. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I really did." Friday morning, 2 days before the tour, a yellow Caterpillar D6 dozer turned off FM 2147 and stopped at my front gate. The driver was a heavy man in a soft white hard hat, 50-something, with the leathered face of a man who had run earth-moving equipment in 3 counties his whole life. He climbed down from the cab, walked up to my gate, and squinted at the digital keypad like it had insulted his mother. I was already walking down the drive with my coffee. "Morning," I said. "Morning, sir. I'm here to widen and grade the entrance for tour traffic Sunday. Got the work order from the seller's agent. Place needs an apron poured by tomorrow afternoon." "Can I see the work order?" He handed it over. The work order had Holloway Premier Realty letterhead and was signed by Amber Holloway, listed as authorized agent on behalf of Brooks Cattle Company Estate. The contracted job was $12,000 of grading, a gravel apron, and a temporary pull-through lane through what was, on the document, my northeast pasture. I read it twice. "Sir," I said, "what's your name?" "Bud Carruthers. Carruthers Excavation, out of Burnett." "Bud, I'm Wyatt Brooks. I am the owner of this property and the only man on this earth authorized to sign work orders for Brooks Cattle Company. I have never met Amber Holloway in any capacity that authorized her to spend my money. I have a cease and desist on file with her real estate commission, and if you put one tooth of that bucket into my pasture, you will be standing on the wrong side of about 4 felonies before lunch." Bud Carruthers stared at me for a moment. He took off his hard hat, wiped his forehead with the back of his arm, and looked at the dozer behind him. "Mr. Brooks, can I sit on your porch for a minute?" We sat on the porch. I made him coffee. Bud Carruthers told me what had been weighing on him for a week. Amber Holloway had hired him 3 times in the last 6 months for lot improvement jobs. Each one, she had told him, was a development parcel ready for grading. On 2 of those jobs, the property owners had not known the work was being done until Bud had already broken ground. He had not been arrested. He had been screamed at by an old woman with a shotgun and chased off by a man in a wheelchair with a notarized deed. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "I think I've been working for the wrong woman." I told him there was a way to make it right. I told him about Sunday. He drove the dozer back onto his trailer that morning, without touching a single inch of my driveway. Before he left, he gave me a written statement on a clipboard and signed it twice. He also gave me the names of the other 2 ranchers Amber had set him on. By the time the dozer rumbled back down 2147, I had 3 more sworn statements feeding into Trent Reardon's file. Saturday morning, Amber's next move arrived in the form of a process server. The lawsuit was 28 pages of bound nonsense, filed in Llano County District Court the day before. The case caption was Hill Country Vista Estates Homeowners Association versus Brooks Cattle Company. The complaint alleged that I had obstructed reasonable buyer access, committed criminal mischief by altering a gate listed in HOA records, and caused emotional distress to community members. It demanded an injunction barring me from interfering with Sunday's tour and damages of $150,000. The lawyer of record was a young associate at a small Austin firm. I recognized the firm. They had a reputation for taking quick paper cases for HOAs that paid in monthly retainers. I drove the lawsuit straight to my own attorney, a quiet old gentleman in Llano named Ross Beaumont. He had handled my father's affairs and my mother's affairs. He would handle mine until one of us died first. Ross read the complaint twice, looked over the top of his bifocals, and laughed the kind of laugh that ends a conversation. "Wyatt," he said, "this thing has the legal weight of a wet napkin. We file the answer Monday morning. We move for sanctions Tuesday. By Friday, her lawyer will be apologizing in writing. But you've got a Sunday before any of that." "I know," I said. "What's the plan for Sunday?" I drank his coffee. I looked at the photograph of his late wife on the credenza. I looked at the framed certificate of his 50-year membership in the State Bar of Texas. "The plan for Sunday," I said, "is to stay out of the way and let her finish writing her own indictment." Saturday afternoon, the ranch filled up the way it had not filled up since Ellie's funeral. Drew McAllister rolled in at 3 with a Texas Rangers SUV he parked behind the hay barn, where it could not be seen from the road. He brought a younger ranger named Whit Lassiter, a former school resource officer. Whit had an easy smile and the blank, watchful eyes of every good lawman I have ever known. Trent Reardon arrived an hour later, in a plain Chevy Tahoe that looked like every other vehicle on FM 2147, He brought a paralegal and 3 extra cameras. Glenda Sutherland flew in from Austin and met us at the kitchen table at 5 o'clock with a binder 8 inches thick. 8 inches. Inside that binder was every Holloway Premier Realty listing that had ever crossed her desk, color-coded by complaint type. Some of those tabs went back 5 years. Hannah set up a cooler of brisket sandwiches and her grandmother's potato salad in the living room. She had driven back down from College Station that morning with 2 of her vet school classmates. Both were happy to spend a Sunday helping a stranger expose a real estate fraud, as long as someone fed them barbecue. Earl Henson pulled into the yard at 6 with his trail camera, a cooler of beer, and his late wife's old Polaroid. He shook Reardon's hand twice and apologized for the strength of his grip the second time. Earl had cried in his truck before he came inside. I knew because the gravel under his door was wet and the rest of the lot was dust dry. The team walked the property until dusk. Drew positioned cameras in 3 pecan trees and along the inner cattle gate. Reardon ran a fiber check on the body camera and the broadcast unit. Whit Lassiter mapped angles for the cruiser he would park behind the live oaks at first light. Glenda set up a remote feed to her field laptop that would sync, simultaneously, to her supervisor in Austin. By full dark, the ranch looked exactly the way it always looked. Quiet, dim porch light on, dogs settled, kitchen warm. That was when the gate alarm pinged. 11:02 p.m. The phone in my hand buzzed twice. Unauthorized vehicle, Tahoe, 8GZW 742. Unauthorized vehicle, F150, 7HXR 884. Drew McAllister was already on his feet. He moved out the back door, around the smokehouse, and up the cedar ridge with a long lens camera, and a quiet that I had only ever seen in rangers and old wildcat hunters. Brett Holloway had pulled his pickup off the shoulder of FM 2147 and parked behind a stand of mesquite. Amber's Pearl Tahoe sat behind it. The 2 of them wore dark jackets that looked bought specifically for this evening. They walked along the outside of my gate with flashlights and a small canvas bag. They were trying to find the camera junctions. They were trying to find the wires they could cut. What they did not know was that the cameras they were searching for were not on the gate. They were in the cedar trees 50 yards above their heads, watching down through the canopy with infrared. They did not know that a Texas Ranger was lying flat on a granite outcrop 40 feet away with a long lens. Drew let them work for 19 minutes. They cut a length of decorative low-voltage line that powered the gate's solar accent lighting. They photographed the keypad. They tried to physically wiggle the latch. Then Brett pointed at something near the inner fence post, and Amber actually laughed out loud. "Tomorrow," she said on Drew's body cam. "Tomorrow this whole gate is firewood." They drove off. Drew came down off the ridge at midnight, opened the screen door without a sound, and dropped a memory card on my kitchen table. "Wyatt," he said, "tomorrow morning, when she rolls up here with her caravan, that woman is going to walk straight into a federal RICO predicate, and she'll never know she made the easiest case of my career." I pushed a brisket sandwich across the table to him. He took it. We sat in my kitchen until 2 in the morning, the 4 of us, not saying very much. The percolator ran twice. A coyote called once from the back pasture, and another answered from the river. Hannah curled up on the couch under the quilt her mother had made the year before she died. The wind picked up around 4. Sunrise was at 6:52. By 7:35, the first vehicle in Amber's tour caravan turned off FM 2147 and started up my drive. The first vehicle was the vintage cream Cadillac convertible, top down, driven by a man in a cream-colored cowboy hat and a bolo tie. The man, I would learn later, was Garrett Pence himself, the principal of Pence Heritage Holdings, a Houston developer worth about $400 million on paper. He had personally driven up from Houston to see the Legacy Ranch his wife had picked out as a possible weekend retreat. Behind the Cadillac came the Pearl Tahoe. Behind the Tahoe came 11 more vehicles. Behind the 11 vehicles came 2 food trucks, one selling barbecue, one selling kolaches. A flatbed followed with a 4-piece jazz quartet, already tuning their instruments. Bringing up the rear was a white production van with the call letters of a San Antonio lifestyle channel painted on the side. They had been told they were covering a luxury hill country open house experience. Amber Holloway stepped out of the Tahoe in white linen, oversized sunglasses, and a smile so bright you could land a small plane by it. She walked up to the gate. She entered the keypad code that her husband had given her. The keypad blinked red. She entered it again. Red again. She turned and waved at a panel van I had not noticed in the second photo of the night before. Out of that van stepped Slattery Lock and Gate, the same locksmith who had cut my chain 7 days earlier. He was carrying a fresh angle grinder and a fresh look of regret. I stood on my own porch. Drew McAllister was to my left. Trent Reardon was to my right. Glenda Sutherland stood behind me with an open laptop. Whit Lassiter was at the corner of the smokehouse with his hand resting on his radio. Earl Henson was at the kitchen window with the Polaroid. I lifted my phone. I tapped one button. The angle grinder met the steel. 3 things happened in the next 4 seconds. The outer gate had been resting in the open position to allow Amber's caravan to roll into the entry zone. It snapped shut behind the last vehicle with the smooth metallic finality of a vault door. The inner cattle gate, 80 yards down the drive, also locked. 14 vehicles, 2 food trucks, 1 Cadillac, and a flatbed of bewildered jazz musicians were now sealed inside 200 feet of crushed limestone driveway. The sirens from FM 2147 began about 9 seconds later. 3 Llano County Sheriff cruisers pulled in first. Lights bar, but no sirens. A Texas Ranger SUV came next. 2 unmarked federal Tahoes rolled in behind them. Last, around the bend, came a single news van with the NBC affiliate logo on the side. Kyle Wexford had brought himself. Amber Holloway stood in the middle of my private drive, with her hands open at her sides and her mouth open at her face. The locksmith had set the grinder down before the first cruiser stopped. The jazz quartet had stopped tuning. Garrett Pence climbed out of his Cadillac with the slow, deliberate movement of a wealthy man realizing he had been brought to the wrong meeting. "Amber," he said, "what is this?" Amber tried to answer. The words did not come out in any order that resembled English. Drew McAllister stepped down off my porch. He walked across the gravel in no particular hurry. He stopped 6 feet from Amber, removed his Stetson, and held up a folded sheet of paper. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I'm Sergeant Drew McAllister, Texas Rangers Company F. I have a warrant for your arrest on 5 counts of forgery of a government document, 2 counts of theft by deception, and 1 count of organized criminal activity. Special Agent Reardon has a federal warrant addressing the wire fraud charges. Please put your hands behind your back." Brett Holloway tried to back up toward his pickup. Whit Lassiter had been waiting for that. Brett's hands were behind his back inside 90 seconds. The TREC investigator, Glenda Sutherland, walked past Amber and removed something small and laminated from her jacket pocket. It was Amber Holloway's Texas real estate license. Glenda placed it gently in a clear plastic evidence sleeve and zipped it closed. "Effective immediately," Glenda said, mostly to the camera lens that Kyle Wexford was now pointing at her. The Lifestyle Channel reporter, who had been stepping off her van expecting to film a champagne service, started filming whatever this was instead. I walked down off my porch, past the cruisers, past the food trucks, past the jazz quartet, and stopped 3 feet from Amber Holloway. I did not raise my voice. "Mrs. Holloway, open house is closed." The federal indictment came down 4 months later. 27 counts. Wire fraud, mail fraud, forgery of public documents, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and 1 count of organized criminal activity. The case named Brett, Pence, and the Austin lawyer who had filed the wet napkin lawsuit. The 4 other ranchers May had identified added their own statements. The U.S. attorney called the case a textbook of weaponized HOA governance. Amber Holloway pleaded out at month 7. 46 months federal. 3 years of supervised release after. Full restitution to all 5 property owners. Lifetime bar from real estate licensure in Texas. Brett Holloway pleaded out at month 8. 28 months and the loss of every retirement dollar he had earned at the county. Garrett Pence settled the civil suits May's other neighbors and I filed against him for $1.2 million. Hill Country Vista Estates dissolved its HOA after the residents themselves filed a class action against the developer. The Bell Tower Clubhouse became a community-owned event space. The stone monument out front was removed by a backhoe one Saturday morning to a polite round of applause. Some of those residents now stop by my ranch on weekends to learn how to mend fence and patch a stock tank. 2 of them have started raising bees. One of them, a retired Air Force colonel, brings me brisket every November on what would have been Ellie's birthday. He never says a word about it. He just sets it on the porch and drives away. I use the settlement money for one purpose. The Ellie Brooks Memorial Land Trust opened its doors in Llano County the following March. The trust does three things. It holds protective conservation easements for small family ranches that want to make sure no future Amber Holloway can ever forge them out of their land. It pays for legal aid for any rural landowner facing a fraudulent annexation, lien, or HOA action in Central Texas. And it funds a scholarship every year for 2 students from Llano, Mason, or San Saba counties. The students must be pursuing degrees in agriculture, veterinary medicine, or land management. Hannah picked the first scholarship recipient herself. She graduated vet school the following May. She came back to Llano and opened a small mixed animal practice on the highway between my ranch and town. She works on cattle in the morning and dogs in the afternoon. On the 3rd Sunday of every month, she comes out to the ranch with 2 of her techs. They give free vaccinations to anyone in the county who can't afford them. We started something else, too. The first Saturday of every October is now Brooks Family Ranch Day. We open the gate. We pull out the long tables under the live oaks. The brisket goes on at 4 in the morning. Earl Henson runs the Domino's table. May Harlow runs the potato salad table. Hannah handles the kid corral. About 400 neighbors come through every year now. Some are people I have known my whole life. Some are people who saved a piece of paperwork that helped a federal investigator put a fraudster in prison. Some are people who just heard there was free brisket and a fiddle. Last October, a kid about 6 years old asked me if it was true. He had heard I once locked a bunch of fancy cars inside my own driveway. He was blonde and sunburned and smelled like sunscreen. I told him it was true. He asked me if it was scary. I told him no, son. The scary part was the day I let the first letter go in the burn barrel without saying anything. Everything after that was just paperwork. If this story made you angry, comment below with your own HOA nightmare. I read every one. If it made you smile, share it with someone who needs to hear that the small folks still have more tools than the loud folks. And if you like this kind of story, slow-built, well-prepared, and finished by people who refuse to back down, hit subscribe. The next one is about an HOA Karen who tried to claim a 5-generation peach orchard as a common area garden. The protagonist is a retired arson investigator who let her dig her own hole, 1 shovel at a time. I'll see you Sunday.